Washington, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about counting atoms. So we've already started working with our periodic table. We know where our metals are located. We know where our metalloids are located. We know each atom is made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So we're going to utilize this periodic table today in order to count atoms. So take out your notebook, take some notes. The first thing I want you to know is something called a subscript. Okay, this is a very small number that goes behind the element or behind the capital letter. So if you look at it, we have hydrogen, and I know that because I looked at my periodic table. We also have sulfur. Okay, so if you look at hydrogen very closely, it looks a little different from sulfur because it has this small number 2 behind it. And yes, that is behind. I know that, it looks like it's in front of the H, but we write from left to right. So that is technically behind the H. So this little number 2 here tells me that we have 2 atoms of hydrogen. Now, sulfur is also here, but it doesn't have a number. But that doesn't necessarily mean this means 0. It actually means 1. Ones are invisible. There's no real need to put them there because we already see one capital S here. So if we look at it, we have hydrogen, we have sulfur. There are 2 atoms of hydrogen. There is 1 atom of sulfur. Okay, there's something else called a coefficient. Now, coefficients are bigger numbers and they go in front of your chemical compound. So we're going to use that same chemical compound. And basically, we have this big number 2 here, which is a coefficient. We have the same chemical compound. Before, we only had 2 hydrogen and we also had 1 sulfur. But what you want to do is you want to go back to the big number. So we're going to do individually each element. We're going to start off with hydrogen. We know that we have 2. We're going to multiply this small 2 towards this big 2. 2 times 2 equals 4. So I know we have 4 hydrogen. Now we're done with hydrogen. We're going to move over to sulfur. Sulfur, we found out only had 1 because there's no number here and ones are invisible. We're going to multiply 1 times 2. Okay, so 1 times 2 means now we have 2 sulfurs. So if you look at it, again, we have hydrogen, we have sulfur. We took that 2, we multiplied it times 2, that gave us 4 hydrogen. We have sulfur, we had 1, we went back to our big number and multiplied times 2, which means we have 2 sulfurs. So pretty straightforward. Okay, if there isn't a subscript behind an element, assume that there is only 1 atom of that element, again, because ones are invisible. All right, the last rule we're going to go over is about parentheses. Now, if elements or compounds are inside of parentheses, then the subscript behind the parentheses applies to everything inside. So let me explain what I mean by that. All right, so we have 3 different elements, and I know that because we have 3 different capital letters. You are only counting capital letters because some elements have 2 letters, but you'll see that it has a capital and a lowercase. So don't get confused by that. This is 1 element. And if we look at our periodic table, I'm going to look for BA, which is number 56 for barium. Okay, we have barium here, but it is not inside of parentheses. We do not have a big number, and we do not have a small number, which means we only have 1 barium. Okay, we also have oxygen here, but it's inside of parentheses. So this is what you're going to do. No, there's no big number, but because it's in parentheses, this subscript of 2 is going to apply to this oxygen. So 2 times 1 oxygen is going to give us 2 oxygens. Then we're going to move over to hydrogen, who is also inside of the parentheses. This hydrogen needs to be multiplied times 2, just like oxygen was, which means that we have 2 hydrogen. So again, barium is not inside of the parentheses. So this number 2, does not apply to that. So we only have one barium. Oxygen, however, is inside of the parentheses. So this 2 applies, which means we multiplied 1 times 2. We have 2 oxygens. Then we have hydrogen, where we had 1 on the inside of the parentheses. We multiply that times 2. We have 2 hydrogen. All right, guys, so now we're going to actually practice what we've learned, okay? So we have a chemical compound here. We know it's a compound because we have 2 different elements that are combined together and they cannot be separated. So if we look at this, we have Mg. Remember, we're only counting capital letters. Mg is magnesium. We found that on our periodic table. We're only counting the capitals. Now, if you look closely at this, this is not carbon and iodine. That's not what this is. This is actually Cl. You'll know the difference between an L and an I, a capital I, because they'll have the the lines for the capital letter I. But if you look at this closely, it's Cl. So we're going to find that on our periodic table. I'm going to look here. And I'm looking at number 17, which is chlorine. So we know we have magnesium. We know we have chlorine. If you look at magnesium, it is not in parentheses. It doesn't have a small number. It doesn't have a big number. So we're not multiplying it times anything. It's only 1. However, if you look at chlorine, no, we don't have to go back to a big number. But there's a small number here. So we have to look at this small number because it needs to be multiplied towards chlorine, which means we have 2. Okay, now we're going to look at aluminum and sulfur together. Now, these subscripts are telling us how many atoms each element has. So if we look at aluminum, we're looking at our subscript here. There's no big number here. There are no parentheses. So you should know we have 2. Then we go back to sulfur. Remember, we only do one element at a time. Look at sulfur. It has a 3 right here, this small number, which is the subscript. We know we have 3 sulfur. Where it gets a little more tricky, how many elements do we have? Now, when I say elements, I mean letters. Now you're looking at the letters. So I have hydrogen, I have sulfur, and I have oxygen. Those are my 3 elements. So if ever on your test or any assignment, if it says how many elements, then you should know we're looking at the letters at that point. You have hydrogen, sulfur, oxygen. Now I want to know how many atoms of each do we have. Let's look at hydrogen. We have here this H, we have this little 2 here, which is a subscript. There's no big number, so we don't have to multiply this times anything. You should know that you have 2 hydrogen. Then we're looking here. This is sulfur. This is its own element. SO, they're not together. S, it's by itself within the chemical compound. It does not have a subscript. Remember, this 2 belongs to the H. S, or sulfur, does not have a number, so we want to look at it really closely. There's nothing to multiply. We only have 1. Then we're looking at oxygen. If you look very closely, we have a subscript here of 4, so you know we have 4 oxygen. Now, if we look at this one, it's a little bit trickier. We have carbon, we have hydrogen, we have oxygen, and another hydrogen. So this is what we're going to do. First, we're going to take a look at carbon. There's no subscript or little number. There's no coefficient or big number here. So we know we only have 1 carbon. Now we're going to take a look at hydrogen and look at this very carefully. We have hydrogen here and we have hydrogen here. There are 3 hydrogens, and we know this because we have a subscript of 3. And then we have 1 hydrogen here. What we're going to do is add those 2 together, because in total we actually have 4 hydrogen. We have 3 here, We have 1 here. That equals 4. 3 plus 1 equals 4. Then we're going to look at oxygen. There's no subscript behind it. There's no big number over here, no coefficient. So we have 1 oxygen. All right, time for something a little bit harder. We have parentheses now. I see some subscripts. I see capital and lowercase letters. So now we have to figure out what elements are in this chemical compound. We have calcium. I see a P here. You got to look at your periodic table. I see phosphorus for P. And then we have a capital O, which we should be pretty familiar with, oxygen. Okay, we're going to take a look at calcium first. I want to know how many atoms of calcium we actually have. There's no big number, but we do have a small number. And this calcium is not inside of the parentheses. So we don't need to look at anything else besides the fact that we have calcium here and a subscript of 3, which means that we only have 3 calciums. Now we're going to take a look at phosphorus. Now, phosphorus is inside of parentheses. We do have a subscript on the outside, and this 4 is also right here, but it only applies to oxygen because this 4 is inside of the parentheses connected with oxygen. So we really only have 1 phosphorus inside of the parentheses. We have to multiply that times 2. 1 times 2 is going to give us 2 phosphorus. Now we're going to look at oxygen. We have 4 oxygens inside of the parentheses. We still have this 2 on the outside of the parentheses. So we have to multiply these two numbers. We have 4 times 2, which is going to give us 8 oxygens. And now we're going to do this one. So this one is pretty much the same format. We have aluminum, we have sulfur, and we have oxygen. So let's look at this closely. Aluminum is not inside of the parentheses. We see a subscript of 2. We do not have a coefficient, the big number. So we know we have 2 aluminums. Now sulfur is alone inside of the parentheses. So we know we have 1 sulfur here. However, because it's inside of the parentheses, we have to go to the small 3. And 3 times 1 equals 3. Then we're going to look at oxygen. We have 4 oxygens right here inside of the parentheses, but our job is not done. We also have this 3 on the outside. We have to multiply 4 times 3, which is going to give us 12 oxygens. All right, last one, guys. We have a lot going on. We have a coefficient here of 2. I see some subscripts going on. I see parentheses. First, we want to figure out what elements we're working with. So we have calcium here. I see a P for phosphorus. And I see a capital O for oxygen. So remember, when we have coefficients, you always go back to the big number every single time for each element. If you look at calcium here, we have a subscript of 3, but our job is not done. We have to go back to the big number and multiply 3 times 2. You should know, if you don't know, use your calculator. 3 times 2 is going to give you 6. Then you want to go to phosphorus. Phosphorus is alone, but it is inside of parentheses. We have an invisible 1 here. So we're going to take that 1 phosphorus, multiply it times 2. That gives us 2. Are we done? No, we are not done. We know we have 2 phosphorus, but now we have to go back to the big number and multiply times the big 2, which is going to give you 4 phosphorus because 2 times 2 equals 4. Now oxygen is a little more tricky. We have 4 inside of the parentheses. What do we do next? We need to go outside of the parentheses because we have to multiply times the subscript 4 times 2 is going to give you 8. Our job is still not done because we have to go back to the big number and multiply 8 times 2, which is going to give you 16 oxygens. All right, that is pretty much it as far as counting atoms. If you need a quick tutorial on how to work these through, I do also have a video on that. Please make sure you go and watch it. And have a wonderful day, guys. And I will see you in class. Bye.